that all of us have a reasonable understanding of how life evolved and how species evolve and the basic concept behind current theory of evolution. Let's now look at the history of life on Earth. Now, the history of life on Earth goes back perhaps 3.8 billion years ago. Now, we can look at the history of life on Earth, and we can break it down into four major eras. The Precambrian era, which began about 4.6 billion years ago and carried through 544 million years ago. The Paleozoic era, which started at 544 million years to 245 million years. The Mesozoic area from 245 to 65 million years. The Cenozoic area about 65 million years ago to the present time. Now, many of these eras, as we look at, as scientists break them down into, often were divided by major extinctions. We have, first of all, going back 500 million years ago, the Cambrian extinction. We have the Permian extinction that took place 245 million years ago. And we have perhaps one of the more interesting ones, the Cretaceous extinction, which basically wiped out the dinosaurs and allowed mammals to evolve. Now, in this diagram, we see some of the key events that took place in the development of life on Earth. To your right, you can see quite clearly the major extinctions that took place. And as we look and trace the historical aspects of life, we recognize that Earth began about 4.8 billion years ago. The first life probably began about 3.8 billion years, which probably consisted of simple bacterial-like prokaryotic cells. It took another 2 billion years for eukaryotic cells to evolve. And the first multicellular animal-like structures evolved perhaps 500 million years ago. And life continued to evolve, and the first plants probably evolved about 440 million years ago. And let's point out some other key things. For example, dinosaurs began their dominance 250 million years ago. They were the dominant species until 65 million years ago, when a rock from the sky basically obliterated that species and allowed, actually, through that process, allowed the evolution of mammals. Once mammals started to gain dominance, we can see that primates could survive very nicely. But when we look at life on Earth with respect to humans, early humans did not come around till about 2 million years ago. Homo sapiens have only existed a few 100,000 years ago. So we basically have been around a speck of time compared to the successful dinosaurs, which basically ruled for almost 200 million years. So if we think we are a successful species, far be it. The dinosaurs hung around for 200 million years. We've been around for a few 100,000 years as a functional modern-day human, no more than 10,000 years. So we really are not as successful as we may think we are. So let's look at the evolution of the Earth per se. The Earth landmass did not always exist the way we see it today. 250 million years ago, the landmass existed as a one gigantic mass called a Pangaea. Now, over time, you can see how through the process of geological shifting, we see that different continents evolved, and now we can see where we stand today. Now, this basically explains why we can find one species on one continent and the same or similar species on another continent, and we wonder, how did these species manage to go across the vast ocean barrier. The reality is they didn't have to. Now, the reality is that prior to the separation of the continents, organisms would basically exist on both sides. And you can see from this illustration that the lizard that exists in Africa right now basically migrated to South Africa while the land was still adjacent to each other. So this, of course, explains why we find similar species on one continent and another continent, as illustrated by this slide showing you fossils that we find in Africa, similar to fossils that we find in South America. Now, we can, of course, trace the history of life by way of fossils and layers of sediments. If we take a slice of the earth, we recognize quite clearly that we have layers of organisms upon layers of organisms, and the lower the layer is, the older that particular organism happens to be. The oldest rocks that we can find dates back to perhaps 3.8 billion years, and we can find remnants of life in these old rocks. We're looking at a rock here that is 3.8 billion years, and we can find evidence of organic material within this rock, which means, of course, that life probably began approximately 3.8 billion years ago. Now, so how did life begin on Earth? To answer that question, let's kind of go back a little bit. If you remember, we said that all organisms have a common genetic code in DNA. Whether you're a yeast or a human, your DNA is very similar, which means that life probably began at a single point in time and at a single point in place. If we look at conditions that existed 3.8 billion years ago, the conditions probably resemble what we find perhaps in hot water ocean vents, where we have large amounts of hydrogen, sulfur, methane gas, and so on. As you can see, if we look at hot water ocean vents, we find this area teeming with microbes. These microbes are able to generate energy from the heat and actually produce prokaryotic cells. We could also find cyanobacter in the hot pools of Yellowstone Park. We're looking at boiling water that still allows life to exist. Now, all of this points to extreme conditions that probably existed 3.8 billion years ago, which provides evidence for the formation of life under these harsh conditions. Now, another possible theory of the origin of life may come from the fact that we can find organic matter in meteors. It's possible that life was actually seeded 3.8 billion years ago from material that came from outer space. Now, let's look at the conditions that existed 3.8 billion years ago. And the hypothesis, remember what a hypothesis is. It's an educated guess and nothing more than that. Now, the hypothesis goes as follows. 3.8 billion years ago, in some remote pool, someplace, ammonia, hydrogen sulfur, water, and methane all came together in the presence of energy to somehow form the molecule RNA. All of us are familiar with RNA. Now, RNA, we know, can produce proteins. Now, once proteins are produced, then the proteins can work with RNA to produce DNA. We have evidence for this. So, we have gone from RNA to proteins to DNA. Now, we don't know exactly how this happened, but the DNA somehow was enveloped or surrounded by lipid material. And this little entity became a prokaryotic cell, which we now recognize as being a simple bacteria. Now, it took 2 billion years for the simple prokaryotic cell to become a eukaryotic cell. And the eukaryotic cell, of course, is the ancestor of all of plants, animals, fungi, protists, and basically all living things except bacteria. So now let's look at the evolution of life and how life evolved into the current 6 kingdoms that we have. If we look at this evolutionary tree, we can see our universal ancestor going back 3.8 billion years. We can see that the first bacteria evolved, and then we see another branch running off to form the protist, the kingdom protist. We see another branch coming off earlier to form the archaea, and then we see other branches forming the plant kingdom, the fungi, the animal kingdom, and of course the protist. Okay, so we have 6 kingdoms broken down into 3 domains. The first domain is the eukarya, second archaea, and the third is the bacteria. Essentially, all of the organisms that we are familiar with belong to the eukarya, and all of these organisms are made up of eukaryotic cells. What we will now do is look selectively at the evolution of plants, animals, and a few other selected groups. The evolution of plants basically starts off with mosses. Mosses are the descendants of early plant forms. Looking at this chart, we can make a couple key comments. Going back about 500 million years ago, we had algae. The algae evolved into mosses about 400 million years ago, and then we can see an important event occurred, that mosses are very, very small. Okay? Mosses are very small. Mosses require lots of moisture, which means that mosses, because they're small and require a lot of moisture, will be near water, of course. Now, something happened in that plants evolved vessels. Now they evolved into vascular tissue. Now, the vascular tissue allowed plants to move a little bit further away from the water, and they can get much, much bigger. But remember, with vessels, a plant can grow larger, taller, and so on. So as we move along in the evolution of plants, another major event took place in that seeds were formed. Now plants did no longer have to be near water. They could be spread in various directions on land, and we started to evolve into gymnosperms, which came first, and then finally the flower evolved, and the flowering plants are referred to as angiosperms, has significant advantages over gymnosperms. Most of our forests today are predominantly angiosperms. So again, we're looking at the evolution of plants, and we see some key events that took place resulting in the plant kingdom that we have today. Now, the evolution of terrestrial animals, obviously this is a little bit more of a hypothesis than a theory, is that to start with, as you can see, we evolved from aquatic fish. Ray-finned fish basically had these various appendages, as you can see, and for a number of reasons, for the most part trying to compete, lobe-finned fish developed, as you can see. These lobe-finned fish could move on land a little bit and take advantage of the opportunities for competition, and eventually the amphibians evolved. Now, the amphibians were the first precursors, of course, to the animals that we know today. So let's look again at the evolution of terrestrial animals. In this case, more specifically at terrestrial vertebrates. Okay, we can see that the lobe-finned fish evolves, the amphibian evolves, and from the amphibian, something takes place that's really remarkable, the amniotic egg. The amniotic egg now means that an organism can move further and further away from water. As you can see, amphibians, of course, lay their eggs in water. But the amniotic egg allowed organisms to move further and further into the land-based area. And as you can see, reptiles evolved first, then came dinosaurs. From dinosaurs, birds evolved, and somewhere after the evolution of dinosaurs, we see mammals evolving, and so on and so on. Finally, we're going to be looking at the evolution of primates. Of course, this is the group that we belong to. Primates began their evolution, as all major mammals, after the destruction of the dinosaurs about 65 million years ago. We can look here and see how early primates evolved. About 70 million years ago, we see some key events that took place. First of all, our ancestors were tree-dwelling. And then peculiar event took place that gave primates some competitive advantages. As you can see, they developed binocular vision. Of course, when you have binocular vision, you can see better, there's no question about it. And therefore, you have a competitive advantage. As you can see, we see a spectrum of primates evolving, and we see how fairly late in the game, the gorilla, chimpanzee, and the humans evolved. The humans, of course, as you can see, are more related to the chimpanzee than they are to the gorilla. In any case, this basically depicts the evolutionary development of the primates with a major development of binocular vision, and eventually, as you can see, the loss of tree dwelling occurred, and walking upright and so on was a competitive advantage for humans. So lastly, we'll look at the evolution of man. Man is the last survivor of the family hominid. Now, many of you probably don't realize that in the evolution of man, there were lots and lots of dead ends. We have perhaps no more than a handful of fossils that we look at trying to understand the evolution of the family hominid. This is a evolutionary tree showing how the different dead ends occurred in the evolution of man, Homo sapien, as we know it today. Now, mankind has existed probably no more than 200,000 years. But we can see in the development of humanoids, so to speak, we see that there were a lot of dead ends, per se. We can see the Homo erectus disappeared. We can see that several other cousins, so to speak, disappeared. Then when we look further up, we see that the Homo sapien and the Homo neanderthal and the Homo heidelbergs and the Homo erectus, boy, they kind of existed pretty much at the same time. Now, there is some thought that the Homo sapiens and the Homo Neanderthal man, existed at the same time and probably competed. Now, two things probably happened. Either the Homo sapiens and the Neanderthal somehow mated and managed to form a new species, or perhaps the Homo sapiens simply outsmarted, outfought, and basically killed the Neanderthal, and this is the result of what we are today.